Okay, so Elizabeth Morrison is Senior Curator of Manuscripts at the J. Paul Getty Museum, and Bryan Keene is Assistant Professor at Riverside City College, and they'll each be sharing a different manuscript with us, and then we'll open it up for discussion afterwards. So, Bryan, would you like to take it away?
Sure. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, excellent.
Excellent. Great. Let me share the screen and we can dive in. Thank you, Reagan, for helping get all this together. And Beth, it's great to be in conversation here with you today. I wanted to share a manuscript that was part of the Ludwig acquisition at the Getty in the early 80s. It's a well-loved book of hours, well-loved institutionally in that we've displayed it in 20 exhibitions on site over the 30 plus years that it's been in the collection. Anything ranging from exhibitions on books of hours to art and science. I included it in a third of the exhibitions that I organized, and one of the images that we'll see was incredibly popular in the collection. But I wanted to start with these groupings of images uh, because it's an image at left that I really wanted to include in a recent exhibition about the cosmos, but there wasn't enough space. And it shows an individual kneeling with a guardian angel that says, with a banderole that says, "Behold your servant," and they're kneeling beneath Christ seated on a rainbow. And this section of the manuscript opens a series of prayers dedicated to Saint Thomas. And a number of times throughout these prayers, the patron's name, Thomas, is included. And that's about as much as we know about this individual. It's a rather small book of hours that was studied by Plotzak and Vanoy in the Ludwig catalogs that came out in the late 70s, early 80s, and then studied extensively by Ronnie Katzenstein in the early 90s. And she really helped advance a number of ideas about the book, specifically looking at dirty pages before dirty pages were really a thing. She noticed that throughout the hours of the Virgin that begin the manuscript, the pages seem to have been quite worn and used. I would also note that in this section dedicated to St. Thomas, there is a lot of use. The pages are quite dirty. This is a sequence that I'm hoping to include in a future project about queer medievalisms with my colleague Arpad Kovac at the Getty, because these pages seem to be touched all over the place, deep down in the gutter, as if the patron were, touching the gutter of the manuscript as Thomas is touching the side of Christ. You see in the image at right, with the Assumption of the Virgin, she's handing over her girdle to Saint Thomas there. So there's great interest in this figure. The other evidence that we have for the patron is a coat of arms. Right at the first image for the hours of the Virgin at the beginning of the manuscript following the calendar, this coat of arms, though, is puzzling. It's not been fully identified. There's been some proposals that what we're looking at on the azure background there is either a glove holding a group of feathers, or possibly wings, or possibly olive leaves. In any case, the silver that's been used for the coat of arms and the wings of the angels is consistent with silver use throughout the manuscript. There's extensive use of gold and silver, as well as mosaic gold, which Getty conservator Nancy Turner has noted and written extensively about, and that's the material we see in the angel's garment just beneath the Virgin. This composition of the Madonna del Parto is quite unique for Neapolitan art at the time, where we think this book was made, and I'll say more about Naples in just a moment. One of the more famous compositions you might know is by Piero della Francesca, his famous work at San Sepolcro of the Madonna del Parto. But then there are these kneeling figures in the large image at left that have gone unnoted in literature on this manuscript. It's clear that they're a king and a queen kneeling before St. Bartholomew. Ronnie Katzenstein suggested that these might represent kings and queens of Armenia, since Bartholomew is a patron saint of Armenia. And I just wanted to remember Armenia today and hope that we're all aware of what's happening in the news. That's the only real political plug I'll make. But in looking more closely at the manuscript, we know that there are a sequence of prayers in Catalan in the book. The earliest discussions of the manuscript attributed the illuminators to Catalunya, Barcelona specifically, and then later to Valencia. But then it was Ronnie Katzenstein who really made an argument for the court of Naples, specifically in the mid 15th century, suggesting the court of Alfonso V, or first of Naples. There are a number of manuscripts made for Alfonso, whose style seems to match this manuscript. A book of hours made for him in Naples is very close in terms of iconography, the sequence of prayers, the sequence of images. But what I'd like to argue in looking more closely at this book and the new scholarship about the artist workshops that may have produced this volume that associate this atelier with Isabella of Chiaramonte, who's the um, daughter-in-law of Alfonso V. She's the wife of Ferrante or Ferdinand of Naples, and she ascends the throne in 1458 with her husband, and her father's name is Bartholomew, and her father's line traces their lineage back to Armenia. They also incidentally trace their lineage to Balthazar, one of the three kings that brought gifts to the Christ child. So I would like to put out there that this may represent Isabella of Chiaramonte and her husband, Ferrante of Naples. She's in the position of honor, whereas he's kneeling there to the left proper of the saint. And that's consistent with a number of other manuscripts made for those patrons, where she is shown in the position of honor. The other note that I wanted to make is about the suffrages of the saints. There are a number of Franciscan saints included throughout the volume, as well as in the calendar. So in trying to figure out the patron, I've been looking at Franciscan churches with some relationship either to Bartholomew or chapels dedicated to Bartholomew with coats of arms that match the coats of arms that we've seen earlier. I wanted to signal this image of Saint Leonard liberating a child from prison. This was an image that I suggested for a show that Beth, Kristen Collins, Larissa Grolemont, and I worked on called Power, Justice, and Tyranny. And we were drawn to this image because Leonard is letting a child out of a cage, essentially, which resonates all too well with those of us here in the United States at this moment. So there is this interest in Franciscan saints throughout the volume. Ronnie Katzenstein's assessment in looking at the saints, they're all male saints represented, was that given the presence of Saint Onofrius, perhaps this individual was part of the cloth guild, since he's the patron saint of cloth merchants. But I'd also like to note Saint Eligius is here, and he's a patron saint of goldsmiths, metal workers. So there might be other routes that we can look for the patron of this book. And then to just say the last few words, this is at left the image of the Adoration of the Magi, where we see one of the most recognizable figures is the middle king wearing the purple robe and the headdress identified as that of John VIII Paleologus, whose image was made famous on medals by Pisanello from 1439 onward, as well as in drawings that circulated in the Italian courts. I've argued that the youngest king in the background with the pink turban represents one of the Mamluk sultans. And now, having done even more research, I know that from Isabella's rule onward, the kings and queens of Naples were directly engaged with the Mamluk sultans, from Saf al-Din Imal to Kait Bey, specifically to seek allyship with the sultans of Egypt in defense against the Ottomans in Constantinople, Istanbul, specifically for sovereignty over Cyprus. And then the two other images here are also showing Magi scenes, one from the hours of Isabella of Chiaramonte at the Houghton, with a similar kind of representation of the three kings, but not the same distinction of their dress, headdresses, or even complexion. And then the image at far right is from the hours of Alfonso of Aragon, one of the hours that are made for him, where there's not an interest in sort of distinguishing the kings by race or origin. So I put it out there as a book that still needs a lot of work done. I would say there are a lot of great books in the Getty collection that still have room for great research. And I just wanted to acknowledge that having overseen the digitization of books for the last 7 years in the collection, we're really indebted to a number of the limited term workers who spent hours digitizing these volumes. So I'll stop sharing the screen perhaps for now to go to some questions, and then I can bring up images again, I think, if we have more questions about them. So I think that takes me to 10 minutes, Reagan.
Excellent. Thank you so much. That was fascinating. Brings up some very interesting issues I hope we can touch on. Why don't we go to Beth, and then we'll take questions for both at the end, if that's all right.
Great. Can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Okay. I just have to escape for a moment so I can bring up. There, perfect. So thank you so much for joining us today. I'm so pleased to be reunited, even if briefly, with Bryan to discuss Getty objects. I know I have my own questions for Bryan based on his presentation. You might have noted that I put into the chat, Bryan had mentioned a co-curated exhibition on power, justice, and tyranny that actually was supposed to be up right now, planned to be up for the time of the election. And unfortunately, of course, the Getty is closed. And so Larissa Grollemond really spearheaded an effort to get that exhibition up online so people could enjoy it. So please do take a few minutes to explore if you have the time. So I'm presenting today on a relatively new manuscript to the collection, entered the collection in 2018, called the Rothschild Pentateuch. And this is a really exciting acquisition for the Getty. It is the first Hebrew manuscript in the collection. And it has been basically in a private collection with no access for the past 50 years. So there is tons and tons of work to be done on it. And my desire to put it forth today is not because I have anything particularly interesting to say about it, but because I have lots of questions that I want to put out there for people to consider. I'm not an expert at all on Hebrew illumination. I don't read Hebrew. And so I really am excited, though, about the potential, the research potential for this manuscript. We've had many, many scholars contact us already with a great interest in it. After acquisition, the first thing we did was digitize it, as Bryan mentioned, which was a huge job because it's something like 600 folios. And so that was an enormous job. And we immediately put all the images on discs and sent them to the National Library of Israel so that scholars in Israel could immediately take advantage of studying the object. So my plan for this manuscript at the moment is we were supposed to be doing a joint symposium with UCLA in March of 2021. Because of the pandemic, we've put that off until the next year, but we're hoping to offer it both physically and virtually at the same time. So hopefully many of you can attend that, and we'll certainly be letting ICMA know about that event. So we have gathered a lot of scholars who actually do study Hebrew manuscripts to get together and discuss this one and its potential. So I'm going to take you quickly through the range of imagery in the manuscript and then introduce sort of three questions, art historical questions to consider. This manuscript is incredible in so many ways, the story of its provenance, other stories associated with it, but today I'm just going to concentrate on some sort of art historical questions. So just to give you a sense of the range of the imagery, this is the opening for Leviticus. You can see the menorah, which would have opened the book, on the right, and then the first words of Leviticus on the left. And this is interesting because it's the only full page illumination in the manuscript. And Leviticus, as many of you know, introduces the sort of way that the tabernacle should be kept, including the lighting of the menorah, the keeping of the oil, all those kinds of aspects. So it really makes sense that the menorah would have opened this. But this sort of introduces the first question, which is, scholars really feel that it was very likely that this was a Christian artist because at this time, the manuscript was probably made in France or Germany, and I'll talk about that a little bit. But at that time in Northern Europe, Jewish peoples were not allowed to join the artist guilds. And so we think that this was done by a Christian artist. So this Christian artist must have been working somehow with the scribe or the overseer of the manuscript in order to understand even where this illumination might come in the book. So that's sort of one of the major questions, is what does this indicate about Christian-Jewish relations between bookmakers in this time period? So just moving on quickly, just to give you, again, a sense of the incredible range. I mean, there's hundreds, literally hundreds of illuminated pages in this manuscript. It's spectacular. There's really not much else like it being made in Europe at this time period, at least that survived. So you can see they have these sort of tapestry-like illuminations on the left, these full page word decorative pages to introduce the major books of the Pentateuch. Then we have all sorts of fabulous marginal imagery, mostly focusing on animals, but part human, part animals, all sorts of interaction. And then again, I like to point out the sense of humor, this multi-legged dragon on the right who has half swallowed some hapless bystander, sadly, and his feet are sticking out of his mouth. So we know that this artist had a sense of humor as well. And then I didn't want to leave out mention of the micrography, which is a whole separate fascinating aspect that we're not going to have a chance to get into today, but I didn't want to pass it up. Micrography at the bottoms of the pages are amazing, forming animals and vegetables and all kinds of things. And just to give you a sense of the size, here I've put a penny, not on the actual manuscript. I printed this out and then put a penny on it, just so you could see how small this micrography is and what skill it took to do these images. So back to the question of the sort of interaction. Most of the imagery in the manuscript, as far as we can tell, is not particularly related to what's happening in the text, which makes sense in a way that probably the Christian artist would not have been able to consult with someone for every single page. What's happening here? What should I put on it? But there are a few cases. One is the menorah that I already showed you. And then this is another one that's a very interesting case. You can see that it's the lion breathing on its cub. And as many of you know, I'm sort of obsessed with the bestiary. And this is a story well known from the Christian bestiary. Here I just give you a sample. Lion breathing on its cub. The story is lion cubs are born dead. The father lion, after 3 days, comes and breathes in their faces, brings them to life. And the idea, of course, is that the lion is God the Father, and he brings Christ back to life after 3 days after the crucifixion in terms of the resurrection. So what is this imagery doing here? Sharon Mintz is the one who has worked the most on this manuscript. And she and I wrote a small piece together for the catalog Book of Beasts. And what she pointed out is that this text, which, as you know, I can't read Hebrew, but this text introduces the story of Abraham and his son Isaac. And as we know, the story is that Abraham is asked by God to sacrifice Isaac, and then at the last minute, God stays his hand. She informed me that in some rabbinical commentaries, actually Abraham does kill Isaac, and then Isaac is literally brought back to life by God. So it's interesting that this image seems to have some relationship to the text that it introduces. And again, the question is, how exactly did that work between the two of them with the language barrier? It really indicates a close working relationship. And so that's sort of one of the things that we want to explore. Just in terms of coats of arms, I'm going to talk about, again, these in a minute. Unfortunately, unlike Bryan's, we think that they mean nothing. They're just decorative because, of course, Jews would not have been ennobled in 13th century Northern Europe, and they're purely decorative, but again, introduces some interesting ideas about assimilation of the Jewish population in Northern Europe at this time period, in that they were interested in introducing this idea of nobility, just like Christians would in their manuscripts. So then, you know, I've tried to find some parallels. As you all know, there are very, very few Hebrew manuscripts, codices to exist to survive from the 13th century. I sent the images as soon as we acquired the manuscript to a very prominent, who most of you know, art historian of French manuscript illumination. And she said, well, whatever it is, it's not French. So I think it must be German. So then I sent it to the most prominent person about 13th century German illumination. And he said, well, whatever it is, it's not German, so it must be French. So this is a huge question. The closest parallel that I have found is this manuscript that's at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, Hébreu 4-4. And it was actually made in the Rhineland, probably in Metz. And so that sort of makes sense, right? Because it's between France and Germany and might show some stylistic affiliations for both. I'll just give you some details here. These are details from the left-hand page. this sort of spread of animals and a hunter with his dog, and then these sort of like hybrid creatures down below. I'll just give you a couple of comparisons from the Rothschild Pentateuch. You can see this sort of leaping boar, hunters, and then down below you can see this sort of half crowned lion thing with two bodies, which is similar to what you're seeing here. You can even see that their eyes are crossed, just as in the manuscript, with this very prominent tongue hanging out. Now, of course, these are not by the same artist. That's not what I'm arguing. I'm arguing that they're using a shared visual vocabulary. This manuscript is dated about 10 years before the Rothschild Pentateuch. And I think it has the closest affiliations in terms of decorative vocabulary. This manuscript is not nearly as highly decorated as the Rothschild Pentateuch, but it is closest in terms of this kind of decoration. And then I'll just give you, this is a detail of the page at right with two knights. And you can see one of the things that's very interesting is that it has these shields, which again are meaningless in terms of family, and they're on these little tiny hooks. And you see that as well in the Rothschild manuscript. And I think that this is something that is very particular and is probably a particular thing that might have been part of the shared vocabulary. Now, Metz was a place that was losing its Jewish population in the 13th century because, of course, they were kicked out of France in 1306. Many parts of the Jewish population moved to Germany. There was a significant Jewish population in Metz at this time period. We do know the name of the patron of the manuscript, which is Joseph ben Joseph Martel, which is a very interesting last name. Unfortunately, we found no documents associated with that person, but it may be a line of inquiry to look into the Rhineland during this time period to see if we could find a possible match. Then the last thing I wanted to talk about was this one page that was inserted into the manuscript in the 15th century, was done by Joel ben Simeon, who many of you know is the sort of most famous Jewish illuminator. He worked in Germany and in Italy. And this particular page, we don't know why it was missing. There's no damage on either side. But it is a figural illumination, which is very different from what we see in the rest of the manuscript. It illustrates Deuteronomy 29. Carefully follow the terms of this covenant so that you may prosper in everything you do. All of you are standing today in the presence of the Lord your God, your leaders and chief men, your elders and officials, and all the other men of Israel, together with your children and your wives and the foreigners living in your camps who chop your wood and carry your wine. And Joel ben Simeon has done a very good job. Here are the elders, the officials, the women, the children, the guy who chops the wood, and the guy who carries your water. So clearly had much better access to the text and much more literal interpretation of what was happening on the page. I just show you two other illuminations from the Washington Haggadah, which is one of his most famous works, to show you the stylistic affinities between these, because Joel ben Simeon did not sign our manuscript. It was simply one page, but he signed many other manuscripts. And there's a new publication coming out focused on the work of Joel ben Simeon. And one of the interesting things is that apparently he did this in many manuscripts, had a single intervention where he did one page. And I find that fascinating. And we have to ask why this page in the Rothschild Pentateuch. One of the interesting things is this is the part of Deuteronomy that talks about the many exoduses of the Jewish people. Is it tied to the fact that this manuscript had been in Northern Europe, had been in France, moved to Germany, moved to Italy, so that the patrons felt some sort of affinity for this particular story? Is it possible that we know the name of the person who had it around this time period, who was a rabbi? Did he have a personal affinity for Moses? Was his father named Moses? All these questions come up as possibilities. I don't know that we'll ever be able to solve it, but there certainly are many intriguing ideas about why this particular page would have been replaced. And that's it.
Wow, fantastic. Thank you very much. So I'm happy to open it up to questions, thoughts, ideas from everyone. Please, as I said, raise your hand or feel free to message the chat. I'll keep an eye there as well. Is that a question from Stephen Scher? Can you unmute yourself, Stephen?
Right, okay. On the very first page opposite the menorah page, there's a very little head with what appears to be a Jewish hat. Is that something?
Let me bring it up again so we can look at it.
Oops.
Yeah, there it goes.
The very first page.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm getting back there. Computer's a little slow. Hello. Why won't it? It seems stuck on the micrography. Hello. I don't know why it won't go back. Oh, well, here, I'll just do this. Oh, now it won't. So sorry. Technical difficulties as always. This page.
Yeah.
Yeah. This guy here, is that whom you're referring to?
No, the little head down underneath.
Oh, here.
Yeah, there.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. There are bishop's hats throughout the manuscript, which is interesting to think of why. Another reason that a Christian illuminator probably did this, because you're probably not going to put a bishop's hat into an illumination if you are a Jewish illuminator. But this hat is a little bit unusual. Let me see if I can zoom in on it a bit for you.
I thought it was the sort of hat that Jews were forced to wear, or.
I am not an expert. Does anybody else have thoughts about this? Anybody want to weigh in on what kind of hat this is?
I would say it's Laura Jacobus. The hats that I can think of have certainly got that kind of ogival peak, but they don't normally have the brim that one has. So I'm not entirely sure.
I've just seen
You know what
other.
I mean? They're almost like, well, if you took away the brim and made it wider, they'd be more like that. But other people might know more.
And I've seen other images that were clearly of Jews, and they are distinguished by that hat, almost like the yellow star was.
Certainly
Anyway.
something to look into. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah.
And we also have a question from Francesca Dell'Acqua. Francesca, do you want to go ahead?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I have a question for Bryan. Is it okay? Yeah, Bryan. Yeah. I want to go back to your manuscript at the page where you were mentioning one of the Palaiologi. I think what.
John the Eighth.
No, there we go.
Yeah.
Why is it not going? Golly.
Yeah.
There we are.
Yeah. So I just want to know a little bit more about this figure, and if you have any ideas why one of the Palaiologi was portrayed here, because you know that one of the sons of the last emperors was sent to southern Italy, and he lived in Cilento, southern than Naples, where he was given a kind of role as kind of between a judge and a notary in a small village in Cilento. So I was wondering if there is any connection with it. Can you expand on this? Because I don't know anything of the manuscript. I'm very pleased to see it. It's beautiful. It's wonderful. Thank you, Bryan.
Yes, thank you, Francesca. I think it's hopefully I'm unmuted. Let's see. Am I? Yes. I think it's a great question. John the Eighth Paleologus is dead by 14. Golly, I just had the dates in my mind and I'll have to look it up. So he's, I think, long past by the time the manuscript is made, but his image, was well known. And after the fall of Constantinople, still we're seeing his image reproduced throughout the peninsula, of course, in a range of works. Including by Benozzo Gozzoli in the Medici Chapel, for example, this kind of suggestion of the emperor. My thinking only recently was that because there's this sort of fervent animosity towards the Ottomans by the court of Isabella and Ferrante, that maybe there is this sort of desire to see the former Byzantine emperor there replace or in the place of honor with the three kings. That would then beg the question, who is the kneeling king in the cloth of gold garments? The Ferrante is quite young at the time. His father, Alfonso V, would have been, a bit older, so could be the figure. But he's a figure that's called out all the time in the literature, and the other two kings are always ignored, just sort of acknowledging that here we have this figure whose image was so well known. But I think your argument about the connection through the family line in southern Italy actually makes more of a case for his presence there, that there is this sort of longer connection to the Paleologan line in southern Italy.
This is Stephen Scher. As you know, I'm involved with metals. That hat just becomes, it becomes a very popular image and is used over and over again, totally separate from its original usage, except for representing rulership. And in fact, eventually, one of the Ottoman sultans is shown wearing that hat. I think it's Suleiman maybe, or somebody like that. So it's not necessarily an indication of a particular, a very specific attachment, but merely an like a crown, an indication of kingship or something.
Thank you. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I'm thinking more about this sort of possible directness in reference to known rulers, because there seems to be in Naples, especially in the Aragonese court through the early 16th century, an interest in associating the Magi with members of the Aragonese court. There's a famous work from 1515 where it traces the lineage of the House of Aragon through the three kings. So, but I suspect you're also right that it can just be this, polyvalent image at the time that isn't necessarily linked to the ruler. Thank you for that. But I see we have questions for Beth too in the chat, so maybe I'll stop sharing so you can go back.
Yep, if we want to switch back over. So Sharon is asking a question about the micrography.
Yeah, so
noticing a connection between the shape of the micrography and the other.
Yeah, it's definitely an area that I'd like to get into further. And I'm just sharing one other aspect of the micrography that I found really interesting, which is this figure over here, which occurs, I can't remember what folio it is, it's in my notes, but it seems to be very, very clearly based on the bestiary story of the wolf biting its own leg. There's a story in the bestiary about how the wolf really wants the sheep, and it steps on a stick and the stick cracks, and so he bites his own arm as a punishment to himself. And it seems clear that this is very clearly based on illuminations that look just like that in Christian manuscripts. So yes, I think it introduces incredibly interesting questions. One of the essays in the Book of Beasts catalog argues for one of the most famous bestiaries of the Middle Ages being owned and perhaps commissioned by a specific Jewish patron, which is really interesting and speaks to the idea of this imagery crossing back and forth between different religions in terms of reusing the symbolism or at least being influenced by the iconography. So it's certainly an area that definitely needs to be researched further.
Have the characters identifying some of them been translated?
They, I have had people look at them. They are actually legible in some places, but not others. So for instance, in this lion that you can see, it's almost like faux letters make up some of the micrography, but then some of it is actually legible. And what's interesting is that at this time period in the 13th century, there was sort of a big tussle about micrography, which, as you know, was a specific thing to Jewish scribes at the time period and a real mark of their skill. And in fact, there were many rabbis at the time who pronounced that micrography should not be a thing in terms of making these images. They were like, enough with the micrography. This is sacred text. You shouldn't be making it into lions and dragons and all these things. And the patrons were just like, actually, we really like the micrography, so they kept doing it. But whether the micrography is actually contiguous with the other text on the page. So for instance, if we look at this, is this really the micrography? Does it spell out things that are related to the Misora Magna, which is this text that you see below, is still something that is open for study. But we do know some of it is legible and some of it is not. Whether it's contiguous with the actual linear text, I think is the next step.
No, I meant the very large black, yeah, the large black.
Sorry, these are catchwords for the next page. So this is the end of a gathering.
And this may relate to a question in the chat from Douglas McLennan. Do you have a sense whether or not the micrography is part of the original composition of the folios, or was it added at a different date?
No, it is contemporaneous.
Okay.
It was all part of the plan for the manuscript. We know that for sure. I think the interesting question is, what is the order of the main text, the micrography, and the illumination? And I think that's something that could be worked on. My suspicion is the illumination was last, but there's really no reason that it couldn't have been the other way around.
Maybe one more question about text, and then we'll move to Helen's questions. But Sarah is asking if it's just biblical text, or is there layers of interpretive text around it as well?
Yeah, so I happen to have a really good slide about that right here. So this is the main text of the Bible. This is the translation into Aramaic, and this is the commentary by Rashi around the edges, and then this is the Misora Magna. And what's interesting is the Rashi scholars are just so interested in this manuscript because this is one of the earliest dated examples of the Rashi commentary.
Thank you. And then Helen's asking a couple of questions just about the idea of illumination in the guild system. Is it possible that it could be illuminated outside of the traditional guild system, or how can we be certain that it was sort of definitely within or without that
I don't
system?
think we can be definite either way. I'm relying more on the scholars who actually study Hebrew manuscripts of this time period. I think it's something that we'll delve into, and I think the sort of eureka moment would be if we could find this actual artist active in a Christian manuscript at the same time period. And so again, much more research to be done.
Let's see, I want to make sure I've covered everything in the chat, but also encourage anybody who does want to go ahead and ask a question to feel free.
Can I ask a question of Bryan? Is that okay if one presenter asks?
Absolutely, yeah.
So Bryan, I'm absolutely fascinated by your research. Have you found anything with this coat of arms anywhere?
No. The challenge is, even, Ronnie Katzenstein had really some great leads on a number of Catalan families in Naples whose arms do look somewhat similar, but upon closer examination, they don't really match. The color combinations are off, or the shape of whatever it is in the Getty manuscript is slightly off. There are a number of books in the National Library in Naples that I'd love to get access to, but as you and I both know, it's really a challenge. Even on the great site Manus Online, there are a number of books that are digitized, but all the ones that I need access to from this moment are not digitized. But I did notice, since our dear friend and former colleague Christine Shaka is on, there is a manuscript at the Walters, in fact, that has been sort of described as related stylistically. It's also circa 1460s or so. There are a number of similar compositions. I don't recall noting any Catalan prayers in the Walters manuscript, but this sort of corpus of material surrounding Isabella of Chiaramonte, I think, will eventually help us localize the book even more. I mean, years ago, you'll remember, Beth, Reagan and I at the Getty put out some of the coats of arms from the collection on Tumblr, and we received hundreds of responses, and unfortunately none of them panned out for this book. It's a really strange thing. If I can just show the coat of arms one more time. I mean, I have no idea what really that is. As I said, it's been described as a glove holding a bunch of feathers, or as a bunch of olive branches. Any of which seems possible, really. I don't know.
And Nancy did confirm that this is integral to the original manuscript.
Correct, yeah. TBD. But that's why I say there are so many great books in the collection that I think still have a lot of potential for research. The other thing that had been noted in the 2001 exhibition, the Renacimiento Mediterráneo, about the number of parrots and peacocks in this manuscript, which would have been seen as exotic birds. And then when Kristen Collins and I team taught a course focusing on this manuscript at Loyola Marymount, one students noticed that in the background of the book throughout there are a number of scenes of ports or ships which seem to relate to the Bay of Naples. That's really great. But there are some other ones where there's like a clear reference, I think, to the Castel Vecchio and the sort of old palace there, rather stylized, not really specific, but and that's consistent with the other books for Isabella and for Alfonso. So.
We do have a few more minutes for questions if anybody is nervously holding back. Now is your chance. I had a question back to the Rachel Pentateuch. I was just wondering about, I know nothing about Hebrew paleography, but I was wondering if that's an avenue that might be helpful in identifying the location of its production.
Actually, it's an interesting question. I haven't had anyone talk to me about that. One of the things that we do know in the 13th century in Northern Europe is that most of the sort of professional scribes writing in Hebrew were itinerant, meaning that there wasn't enough Hebrew manuscripts being produced at any one place to really keep them fully employed. And so they sort of move from place to place. So that's not going to help us that much. But what I think will help us a bit, interestingly, is some of the liturgical elements of the text, the way that it's written out, the way that it's arranged, particularly in the last part of the manuscript, which is not actually the Pentateuch, but is the extra texts that have a liturgical value. And so one of the scholars who has studied that has said that there are actually some elements that are English in that. And so the manuscript is dated to 1296. And so there's some question about whether either the patron, the scribe, had actually been active in England, was part of the exodus from England when the Jews were forcibly exiled. And then went to France or Germany, again, if people have thoughts about what this is. And then, of course, the Jews were exiled from France in 1306, and then they were exiled in the late 14th century from Germany, and that's probably when this manuscript ended up in Italy, which we also know from some ex libri at the end of the manuscript. So it really did have a fascinating journey as it went along.
Looks like Brian may have answered this in the chat, but Sophie asked a question back to the Neapolitan Book of Hours. Is this the only instance of the coat of arms? And if so, any thoughts about its location within the book?
Yeah, thank you, Sophie. It is a great question. That is the only instance of the coat of arms. It comes directly after the calendar, the first images of the, the Madonna del Parto. And so I had suggested earlier this year in a seminar for some graduate students that I think it does relate in some ways to that idea of the, Virgin with child, fertility, childbirth. There are some extended prayers in the Office of the Virgin about fertility. There's this extended sequence of Christ's childhood, Christ taking his first steps. And in addition to the presentation in the temple, the things that we expect to find. So perhaps there is this longing. We only see the one kneeling male patron in the volume and in the king and the queen that I showed. So yeah, there's a lot of possibility for what it could mean. But if anyone else wants to take that on, I don't, hold any sort of guard over this book. It's really everyone's volume.
Bryan, I'm obsessed with the infancy scene with the Madonna. Is there, in your researches, I've always wondered if that was a copying mistake from iconography from another book. Have you found anything relative to that?
For the Madonna del Parto one, or the one?
No, the
childhood
Virgin, what is he, taking his first steps?
First steps, yeah, exactly. I hadn't thought of it in that way, but I'm happy to look at it more closely. I think that was in your exhibition on the family, right?
Yes, and it's always, I'll just show it
if you
to
have it
everyone
immediately
really
up.
quickly so that they can see it. Because I've always just sort of been intrigued. This is what I'm talking about.
Yeah, exactly. What's she doing?
I'm not sure if that was I always wondered if there was like a St. John behind her that was actually coming, you know, there was an arm there, but it's always sort of fascinated me as to why, you know, why this.
That is unusual. There are some other really strange elements in this volume, so I'll keep this one in mind.
And I think I saw that there was a question from Nava. Hi, Nava, about the animals. And yes, I think that probably the, from what we understand about how this worked, the micrographers were completely different artist scribes who were not the same as the scribe of the main text. In fact, we have their names. I believe the main scribe was, sorry, I have to look this up on the page. But the main scribe was named Elijah ben Meshalem, and the scribe of the micrography was Elijah ben Yehiel. So we actually do know that they were separate and they were Jewish.
And then one more question from Sarah, curious about Joel ben Simeon's individual pages. Are they always from Exodus? Also the extra texts in the Rothschild Pentateuch, are they always on the same page as biblical texts, or do they come at other parts of the book?
Yeah, excellent question. So I'm as eager as you, Sarah, to find that out. This publication about Joel ben Simeon is coming out very soon, and we'll have a complete list of his known works. Evelyn Cohen has been working on Joel ben Simeon for many, many years. And other art historians are weighing in, and we actually know quite a bit about him. He was very interesting in that he was born in Cologne, worked in Germany, moved to Italy, moved back to Germany for several years to work, moved back to Italy, talking about this movement of artists. I think is really interesting to have this documented artist who did that. And so we'll know more. One of my questions was maybe Joel ben Simeon, this was his favorite episode from Moses's life and painted it multiple times. So I will be very interested to see what these other individual pages were. The extra text, and I'm so embarrassed that I cannot, Bryan, do you remember the name, or Nava? Nava must know. Nava, can you weigh in? The section at the end with the little word panels.
The little word panels, do you mean the haftarahs?
Yes, that's it, thank you. So those are the extra texts at the end of the manuscript that Nava was mentioning. She really helped us with this manuscript because she was the only person in the department who knew Hebrew, thankfully. So that was the main text. The Mazorah Magna is always associated with the Pentateuch itself, and that's the micrography at the bottoms of the pages. And Nava, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think there's micrography in the Haraftah part of the manuscript. Is that correct?
No, none, and they're much less illustrated or illuminated.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks for answering these questions.
Clearly, the provenance of the Provo-Urna doesn't help in tracing the history of the Pentateuch. Was it held for the past 50 years by the collector, or was someone for whom the Pentateuch had meaning? Yes, I think the Pentateuch had meaning for everyone who's owned it in its history, including the Getty. I did do the story of the provenance is one of the great stories of any manuscript that we know of, I think, in the world. And I wrote a short blog post about it on the Getty Iris, tracing all of the individual owners, when they owned it, and the exciting ways that it passed hands, the evidence we have for it in the manuscript. So please do check that out. I'm sorry that we don't have time to go through it today because it's amazing.
Yeah. I just put it in the chat so everyone can find Beth's blog.
Bryan.
Yeah.
Yes, please, Yuri, whoever you are, send me questions. My email is emorrison@getty.edu. The only thing you have to remember is E for Elizabeth, not B for Beth. E, Elizabeth.
I think we're coming up to the end of our hour, but I just wanted to give us maybe one last round in case anybody's sitting on their question. But this has been absolutely fascinating. I feel like we've uncovered some interesting areas of future research.
One more question for Bryan. Are you planning on publishing this as an article?
Yeah, I was working on a short piece and then we went into quarantine. And so in those last days at the Getty, I was quickly photographing pages and eventually I might contact you for the microfilm and all these things, but no.
Okay, very
Yes,
good.
and then, as you know, Kristen and I are continuing to think about Balthazar. So there are some other strands that we've been talking about as it relates, because there's that constant question about, how people are personalizing the image of the three kings.
Yeah.
So that will continue there as well.
Yeah, I'm sure you will keep me posted. The only other thing I was going to say is that, I did take on this project with the Pentateuch with a little bit of trepidation, because this is not my area of specialty. And I think that it just shows us that we have to press our boundaries beyond what we're comfortable with, and we have to engage with other scholars. And that's why I'm so grateful to my colleagues at UCLA for offering to do this symposium with the Getty, where we can bring in the experts to have a great conversation. Part of the reason we want to do it in person instead of just doing it online is because the second day of the symposium is just for the scholars to look at the manuscript in person. And that, as you know, is so important. And then the hope is that this will eventually become a monograph dedicated to this object from historical, religious, text, image, like all different angles. And I think that kind of collaborative scholarship is really going to be so important as we move forward.
Excellent. Thank you very much to Beth and Bryan for joining us and for giving us these incredible presentations and things to think about. So please, everyone else, join me in expressing your gratitude, if nothing else through a little reaction. But thank you so much, and we look forward to hearing more about both of these manuscripts.
And thank you, Reagan.
And thank you, Ryan, for your help putting this together as well. And Reagan,
Yeah,
obviously.
thank you, Ryan.
Thank you. All right, goodbye all.